In one of Chicago's most prestigious skyscrapers, a silent drama is about to unfold in the executive halls of Sterling Technologies. While Robert Sterling watches his $50 million empire crumble under a legal battle that seems impossible to win, and while 11 of America's most expensive lawyers desperately race against the clock to find a solution that appears not to exist, an invisible woman pushes her cleaning cart through the very same halls where his fate will be decided. Grace Washington carries with her 15 years of legal experience and knowledge that could change everything. But no one sees her, no one hears her, no one imagines that the answer to a multimillion-dollar problem could come from someone earning $12 an hour cleaning offices. Yet sometimes, the most extraordinary solutions come from the most unexpected places. And when Grace finally finds the courage to speak up, she's about to prove that 2 minutes of insight can be worth more than months of costly expertise, if anyone is willing to listen.
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The air conditioner whispered quietly on the 43rd floor of the glass and steel skyscraper overlooking the Chicago skyline. Robert Sterling adjusted his Italian-framed glasses on his nose, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped another page of the financial report. The red numbers seemed to leap off the paper like open wounds, each digit a stab in the empire he had spent 3 decades building. 58 years old, 30 of them dedicated to turning a small startup in his college apartment into a tech giant. And now, Robert closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of a throbbing headache on his temples. The mahogany and leather office, with its panoramic view of Lake Michigan, suddenly felt like a golden prison. $15 million in losses just this quarter, he murmured to himself, his voice echoing in the oppressive silence of the office. The smell of cold coffee mingled with a subtle hint of his expensive cologne, creating an atmosphere that once symbolized success but now carried the bitter taste of despair. The following pages offered no relief. Each downward graph, each bleak projection, was a cruel reminder of how one single lawsuit had completely paralyzed the Sterling AI project. 5 years of development, $200 million invested, all frozen while lawyers debated patents and copyrights in courtrooms that seemed like a parallel universe. Robert rose from the Italian leather chair, feeling his knees protest. The reflection in the window glass showed a man he barely recognized. Disheveled gray hair, deep eye bags, a loosened silk tie in an unconscious gesture of frustration. When was the last time he slept through an entire night? When was the last time he didn't wake up at 3 a.m., his heart racing with thoughts of bankruptcy and ruin? Below, traffic on Michigan Avenue flowed like blood through the city's veins. Ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, oblivious to the drama unfolding atop this glass tower. Robert pressed his palm against the cold window, feeling the contrast with the feverish heat of his skin. The intercom emitted a soft sound, slicing through his dark thoughts like a razor. Margaret's voice, his secretary for 15 years, sounded controlled, but he detected the tension she was trying to hide. "Mr. Sterling? I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Robert returned to his desk, the leather chair creaking softly under his weight. "Come in, Margaret." The solid oak door opened with an almost inaudible whisper, and Margaret Patterson entered with precise, calculated steps. At 55, she was the embodiment of efficiency, but today her hands trembled slightly as she held a folder of documents. Her blue eyes, usually calm, carried a storm of worry. "Mr. Sterling?" she began, her voice betraying the anxiety she tried to mask. "I just received reports from our market intelligence team. Innovate Tech announced they're launching a product similar to our Sterling AI next quarter." Robert felt the blood drain from his face. Innovate Tech, his main competitors, led by that arrogant young man, David Chun, who had already tried to buy him out twice. And Technofuture? "Also, sir, they're speeding up development. Our sources say they plan to launch still this year." Margaret laid the folder on the desk, her hands visibly shaking now. "Mr. Sterling, while we're stuck in this lawsuit, they're taking the market that was ours." The silence that followed was so heavy Robert could hear his own heart beating. 30 years. 30 years of building, innovating, leading. And now, in a matter of months, it could all collapse like a house of cards in a storm. Robert stood again, walking to the bookcase that covered the entire east wall of his office. biographies of great entrepreneurs, strategy manuals, awards, and honors collected through decades of hard work. Every object was a reminder of what he had achieved and what was about to slip away. "Margaret," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. "How much do we have in liquid reserves?" "About 42 million, sir. But with the current losses—" "I know." Robert clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his palms. The physical pain was almost a relief compared to the psychological agony. "Margaret, I want you to cancel all my appointments for next week." "Sir." Robert turned, and Margaret could see something in his eyes she had never seen before. A fierce, almost wild determination mixed with the desperation of a man feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. "I'm assembling the most expensive and talented legal team money can buy. I don't care if it costs 10 million, 20 million. I don't care if we have to sell properties or stock. This lawsuit ends now, Margaret. Not in 6 months, not next year. Now." The intensity in his voice made Margaret step back half a pace. In 15 years working for Robert Sterling, she had seen him face crises, tough negotiations, moments of extreme pressure, but never like this as a man fighting for his own survival. "I want you to contact Harrison, Klebert and Associates in New York. They're the best in intellectual property. And Matthews Legal Group in Los Angeles. They have the top tech litigation specialists on the West Coast." Robert walked back to the window once more, his reflection now looking more solid, more determined. "And Margaret." "Yes, sir. Prepare for war, because that's what this is going to be." The constant noise of ringing phones had turned Margaret Patterson's office into a military operations center. Papers scattered across every available surface, 3 computers running at once, and her voice already hoarse from so much talking. It was only 10 a.m., and she had already consumed 4 cups of coffee, each sip a desperate fuel to keep up with the frantic pace Robert Sterling had set. "Harrison, Klebert and Associates, please. I need to speak with Margaret Hoffman immediately," she said into the phone, while typing furiously on her laptop with her free hand. On the screen, a detailed spreadsheet showed names, specialties, and, most importantly, the hourly rates that would make any ordinary person faint at the shock. Robert's office door had been closed for 2 hours, but Margaret could imagine her boss inside, pacing back and forth like a caged lion, planning every move of this operation he himself had dubbed a war. "Miss Patterson?" The smooth, confident voice of Margaret Hoffman echoed through the line. "I heard you have an interesting situation in Chicago." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. Margaret Hoffman, no coincidence they shared the same name, was a legend in Manhattan's corporate legal world. 48 years old, magna cum laude graduate of Harvard, former Supreme Court clerk, and senior partner at one of Wall Street's most respected firms. Her $1,200 per hour fee wasn't just a number. It was the price of absolute excellence. "Ms. Hoffman, Mr. Sterling would like to hire your services for an extremely complex intellectual property issue. We are prepared to pay whatever it takes." A calculated silence followed. Margaret Patterson pictured the attorney in her office on the 50th floor of some glass skyscraper in Manhattan, weighing not only the case but the prestige of accepting a client willing to spend without limits. "Interesting. Send me the preliminary documents. If the case is as fascinating as it sounds, I could be in Chicago by Thursday." "Perfect. And, Ms. Hoffman, Mr. Sterling is assembling a team of 11 specialists for this case. We expect close collaboration." 11? Surprise was evident in the lawyer's voice. "Who else are you hiring?" Margaret checked her list, feeling a strange sense of power. When else had she coordinated millions of dollars worth of legal talent in a single morning? James Mitchell from Boston, David Chun from Los Angeles, Patricia Williams from Washington, D.C., among others. Mitchell and Chan? Now there was genuine respect in Hoffman's tone. "Sterling isn't kidding around, is he?" As soon as she hung up, Margaret immediately dialed Boston. James Mitchell was a different kind of legend, a specialist in contracts and corporate agreements, known for his almost supernatural ability to find legal loopholes where others saw only solid walls. At 52, He had saved more Fortune 500 companies from seemingly impossible lawsuits than any other East Coast lawyer. Mitchell & Associates answered a secretary with a refined Boston accent. James Mitchell, please. It's urgent. Regarding the Sterling Technologies case. The transfer was immediate. Mitchell's deep voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades in the country's highest courts. Mitchell speaking. I've heard rumors about you. Intellectual property. Exactly. Mr. Sterling needs the best, Mr. Mitchell. There's no budget limit. My rate is $1,500 per hour, plus expenses and support staff. Margaret swallowed hard.
$1,500.
Per hour. I accept. Then I'm in. When is the first meeting? Thursday in Chicago. I'll be there. 2 lawyers hired, 9 to go. Margaret felt a mix of exhaustion and euphoria. Each call was like a high-stakes negotiation. Every yes, a small victory in the war Robert had declared. The phone rang before she could dial the next number. Margaret Patterson speaking. This is David Chun from Los Angeles. I heard you're putting together something special. Margaret almost dropped the phone. David Chun, not to be confused with David Chun from Innovatech, her nemesis, was the West Coast litigation wizard. 45 years old, razor-sharp mind, with a record of wins in cases that seemed lost from the start. His $1,800 hourly rate was considered an investment, not an expense. Mr. Chun, how did you hear? The specialized legal world is smaller than you think. Hoffman called me 10 minutes ago. Mitchell too. When Margaret Hoffman and James Mitchell accept the same case, everyone gets curious. Margaret felt a shiver of satisfaction. Robert Sterling had asked for the best, and apparently the best were already talking about this case. We're interested in your services, Mr. Chun. $1, $800 per hour, my full team, full access to documents, and complete autonomy over litigation strategy. I don't do micromanagement. I accept all conditions. Then we'll see you Thursday. And, Ms. Patterson, get ready for an interesting battle. The day passed in a haze of phone calls, negotiations, and express contracts sent by email. Patricia Williams from Washington, D.C., federal regulations expert, $1, $300 per hour. Robert Davidson from Atlanta, technology dispute specialist, $1, $400 per hour. Sarah Thompson from Denver, damages and compensation expert, $1, $100 per hour. Each yes came with a price that made Margaret tremble inside, but also with a growing feeling that Robert Sterling was assembling something unprecedented in the American corporate world at 5 p.m. She finally knocked on Robert's door. He stood by the window, still in the same position she had left him that morning. But now there was something different in his posture. Straighter, more confident. I got them all, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice hoarse but triumphant. 11 of the country's top specialized lawyers. Margaret Hoffman flying in from New York. James Mitchell from Boston. David Chun from Los Angeles. The total cost is going to be... I don't care about the cost, Robert interrupted, turning with a smile Margaret hadn't seen in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I feel like we have a real shot at winning. Robert walked to his desk and picked up the financial report that had haunted him that morning. For a moment, he held it in his hands, feeling the weight of the paper, the smell of the ink, the texture that had become a symbol of his torment. Then, with a decisive motion, he tossed it into the trash. Margaret, book the main conference room for Thursday at 9 a.m. I want water, premium coffee, and the best audiovisual presentation our IT department can prepare. He turned back to the window, but now his reflection showed a transformed man. Let's show these lawyers exactly what they're fighting for. Margaret felt a thrill of anticipation. In her 15 years working for Robert Sterling, she had learned to recognize that gleam in his eyes. It was the same look he wore when closing multimillion-dollar deals, launching revolutionary products, turning impossible dreams into tangible reality. And, Margaret, Robert said, without turning from the window, his voice full of confidence that seemed to radiate warmth across the office. Get ready to witness history. This team isn't just going to win this case. They're going to crush any hope our competitors have of taking us down. The afternoon sun painted the office in golden tones, and for the first time in months, Robert Sterling felt like the king of his own castle again. 11 legal gladiators were on their way to Chicago, each costing a fortune, each a precision-crafted weapon in the war he was ready to win. Thursday couldn't come soon enough. The main conference room at Sterling Technologies was a modern temple to corporate power. The tempered glass walls offered a spectacular view of downtown Chicago, while the solid mahogany table, large enough to seat 20 people, reflected the LED lights embedded in the ceiling like a dark mirror. The subtle scent of Italian leather from the chairs mixed with the aroma of premium Colombian coffee that Margaret had arranged. Robert Sterling sat at the head of the table, his hands tensely clasped over the polished surface. 25 days had passed since he made the decision to hire the most expensive legal team in America, and today, finally, he would get the answers he needed. His navy Armani suit was impeccable, but the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. Sleepless nights, constant worries, the crushing weight of watching his competitors gain ground every day. Margaret Hoffman sat to his right, an impressive stack of documents precisely organized before her. At 48, she radiated the cool confidence of someone who had faced Wall Street's worst corporate nightmares. Her black Chanel blazer contrasted sharply with her pristine white blouse, and her gold-rimmed glasses reflected the room's lights as she reviewed her notes for the 10th time that morning. Across the table, James Mitchell nervously adjusted his Hermes tie. The veteran Boston lawyer, usually unshakable in any situation, drummed his fingers on the mahogany table, a nervous tick his colleagues rarely saw. His graying hair was slightly tousled, evidence of the long hours spent buried in case documents. David Chan, the litigation wizard from Los Angeles, sat silently at the corner of the table, his dark eyes scanning every colleague's face as if trying to read their thoughts. 45 years of courtroom experience had taught him to detect weaknesses before they were even spoken, and at this moment, he saw something deeply troubling. "Mr. Sterling," Margaret Hoffman began, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "After 3 weeks of intensive analysis, our team has reached some conclusions about your case." Robert leaned forward, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation.
"I'm listening."
The joint venture contract with Megacorp is, frankly, one of the most legally ambiguous documents I've analyzed in 25 years of practice, Hoffman said, removing her glasses and cleaning them with precise movements that masked her own frustration. Clause 7C, specifically, is a legal labyrinth. James Mitchell interrupted, his Boston accent thick with barely contained irritation. "With all due respect, Margaret, ambiguous is an understatement. That clause was drafted by someone who was either a malevolent genius or completely incompetent." A chill ran down Robert's spine. "What exactly are you saying?" David Chin finally spoke, his voice calm but heavy with gravity. "Mr. Sterling, the clause in question can be interpreted in at least 4 different ways. Each interpretation leads to a completely different legal outcome." 4 ways. Robert's voice rose higher than he intended. "What do you mean?" Patricia Williams, the damage specialist from Washington, D.C., opened a laptop and projected the document onto the giant screen in the room. The words appeared in enlarged font, every comma and period seeming to weigh tons. "The contracting party holding ownership rights to the underlying intellectual property shall retain exclusive control over implementation and development, except in circumstances where substantial modifications to the base algorithms are required by the party receiving the licensed rights." Williams paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. "This sentence, Mr. Sterling, is the heart of the entire problem." Robert read and reread the projected text, feeling as if the words were rearranging themselves before his eyes. "I don't get it. It seems clear we retain control." "Oh, but here's the catch." James Mitchell stood and walked to the screen. "The question is, who defines what counts as substantial modifications? And, more importantly, who defines what base algorithms are?" Margaret Hoffman sighed deeply, a sound that echoed through the room like a dark omen. "Our first interpretation suggests you retain full control. The second says Megacorp has veto power over any changes." The third implies shared control. And the fourth? She paused as if the next words were poison. Suggests you may have inadvertently ceded all rights to Megacorp. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert could hear his own heartbeat, the almost inaudible hum of the air conditioning system, the distant noise of traffic 43 floors below. $50 million. 5 years of development. The future of his company. All hinging on how one single sentence was interpreted. And what is the correct interpretation? Robert asked, his voice barely a forced whisper. David Chun and Margaret Hoffman exchanged glances. A moment of silent communication that made Robert's stomach churn. That's the problem, Mr. Sterling, Chun said slowly. There's no consensus. Not even among us. What do you mean, no consensus? Robert stood abruptly, his leather chair rolling back with a screech. You are the best lawyers in the country. I paid a fortune to be sure, not to have more doubts. Sarah Thompson, the damage specialist from Denver, tried a diplomatic approach. Mr. Sterling, we understand your frustration. But complex cases require… No! Robert slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Don't give me complex cases. While you debate interpretations, Innovate Tech and TechnoFuture are launching products that should be ours. Every day of delay costs my company $500,000. An awkward silence settled. The 11 most expensive lawyers in America were being scolded like freshmen, and everyone knew it. James Mitchell tried to regain control. Mr. Sterling, I understand your urgency, but the American legal system doesn't operate on corporate deadlines. A case this complex would typically take… How long? Robert cut in, his voice sharp as ice. 18 months to 3 years, depending on appeals. Robert felt as if the floor had opened beneath him. 3 years. His company wouldn't survive 3 months at this pace, let alone 3 years. And what if we settle? He asked, clutching at any possibility. Margaret Hoffman consulted her notes. Megacorp is asking for 70% of the rights to Sterling AI. They claim their contribution to development was greater than initially agreed. 70%? Robert's voice came out as a roar of a wounded animal. 70% of the project I developed in MY Company with MY money? David Chun leaned forward, palms flat on the table. Mr. Sterling, we need to be realistic. If their interpretation is correct, I lose everything, Robert finished, his voice now a defeated whisper. 30 years of work, hundreds of millions invested, all because of one poorly written sentence in a contract. The weight of reality crushed the room like an avalanche. The most expensive lawyers in America, with their fees of thousands per hour, were just as lost as anyone else in this legal maze. Robert walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. Below, Chicago pulsed with normal life. People heading to work, cars and traffic, life moving forward as his world collapsed in slow motion. How much time do you need to give me a definitive answer? He asked without turning. The lawyers exchanged nervous looks. Patricia Williams was the first to speak. Mr. Sterling, cases of this nature. Days, Robert interrupted, turning with eyes that seemed capable of cutting steel. Not months, not weeks. Days. I don't care if you have to work 24 hours a day, hire more experts, or consult every retired Supreme Court judge. I want a winning strategy in 72 hours. Margaret Hoffman opened her mouth to protest, but something in Robert's gaze made her hesitate. This was no longer just a wealthy client demanding the impossible. This was a man fighting for survival, and desperate men are capable of extraordinary things. 72 hours? Robert repeated, his voice echoing through the room like a final verdict. After that, either you give me a solution, or I find someone who will. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of an ambulance siren cutting through the Chicago air, an ominous sign fitting for an empire bleeding to death. The city of Chicago was beginning to dress itself in twilight colors as Grace Washington parked her 2008 Honda Civic in the employees' lot of Sterling Technologies. The car, with its 143,000 miles on the odometer and a small dent on the right rear door, stood in sharp contrast to the BMWs and Mercedes parked in the reserved spots on the garage's ground floor. Grace turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment, soaking in the silence that followed months of the car's constant noise. At 45 years old, every line on her face told a story of struggle, endurance, and an unwavering dignity that not even the hardest times could shake. Her brown eyes, sharp and observant, reflected a wisdom earned through experiences most people couldn't even imagine. Her navy blue cleaning company uniform was impeccably pressed. Grace always made sure of that. "The way you present yourself is the first thing people notice," she used to say to her son, Marcus, and though people rarely truly noticed her, she maintained her standards. The badge hanging from a simple chain displayed her photo and the name Grace Washington, Night Services. But it said nothing of the 15 years she had spent as a paralegal at some of Chicago's most respected law firms. Grabbing her worn leather bag, a Christmas gift Marcus had saved for months to buy the year before, Grace ran her fingers over the faded surface, feeling the familiar texture that comforted her. Inside, carefully organized in a plastic folder, were her study materials. Notes on interesting cases, legal magazine articles she accessed online via the public library, and a spiral notebook where she jotted down observations and legal insights. The service elevator hummed softly as it carried her to the 33rd floor, where the cleaning staff locker room was located. Grace greeted Jose, the night supervisor, with a silent nod. They had learned long ago that unnecessary words only slowed the work ahead. "Executive floor tonight, Grace," Jose said in his English, tinged with a Mexican accent, consulting the clipboard where he organized the night's tasks. The big lawyers seemed to be staying late again. Lots of paper, lots of spilled coffee. Grace nodded, feeling a familiar pang of curiosity mixed with melancholy. The executive floor always brought back memories of when she sat on the other side of the desk, when her legal knowledge was valued and sought after. Now she was just a shadow passing through after hours, invisible to those who would probably benefit greatly from her expertise. She grabbed her supply cart. Cleaning products arranged with military precision, microfiber cloths folded perfectly, extra trash bags, and headed to the elevator that would take her to the 43rd floor. During the ride up, Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath, preparing herself mentally for the night ahead. The doors opened to reveal the silent hallway of the executive floor, lit only by emergency lights and the glow of the city through glass windows. Grace had cleaned these offices hundreds of times, knew every corner, every stubborn carpet stain, every fingerprint smudge on the glass doors. But more than that, she knew the secrets these offices held. Documents left on desks, phone conversations overheard by accident, the body language of executives who never imagined being watched. She started in the main conference room, where she knew the lawyers had spent the day. The scent of expensive coffee still hung in the air, mixed with leather chairs and an almost palpable tension that seemed embedded in the walls. Grace had learned to read the mood of meetings by the traces they left behind. Half-full water glasses indicated nervousness, crumpled napkins suggested frustration, and the way chairs were arranged told stories of alliances and conflicts. Tonight, the chairs were in complete disarray. Some pushed away from the table, others turned at strange angles, one still rocking slightly. Grace recognized the signs. It had been a tough meeting, probably heated arguments and abrupt exits as she collected disposable cups and wiped down the mahogany table. Her eyes settled on some papers that had been left behind. A professional instinct honed over years as a paralegal made her glance at the headers. Sterling Technologies versus Megacorp, contract analysis, joint venture, legal interpretations, Clause 7C. Her heart quickened slightly. Intellectual property cases had always been her specialty when she worked as a paralegal. Before being laid off during the 2008 cuts, she had assisted on similar cases, seen brilliant lawyers wrestling with contract ambiguities that seemed impossible to resolve. Grace looked around to make sure she was alone, then allowed herself to quickly read the top document. Her eyebrows furrowed involuntarily as she processed the wording of the problematic clause. 15 years away from the courtrooms hadn't dulled her analytical skills, and she immediately saw why the lawyers were struggling. "Base algorithms," she murmured under her breath, methodically cleaning around the documents without moving them. The phrase reminded her of a similar case in 2007, where the definition of core technology had been key to a surprising victory. The sound of the elevator brought her back to work, pushing legal thoughts into the corner of her mind reserved for abandoned dreams. One of the lawyers, she recognized James Mitchell from a photo in the Chicago Tribune, emerged into the hallway, his tie loosened and hair tousled, showing the stress of the day. Grace became even more invisible, if that were possible, moving silently as he passed by as if she were part of the furniture. Mitchell entered one of the smaller offices, turned on the light, and Grace could hear the muffled sound of a tense phone conversation. She continued her work, wiping every surface with the meticulous care that had become her trademark. But part of her mind stayed fixated on the documents she had seen, analyzing and reanalyzing the legal language, looking for angles that perhaps some expensive lawyers were missing by being too close to the problem. At 11 o'clock, Grace paused to drink some water and check her phone. A message from Marcus made her smile. A photo of him in the community college library, studying for the LSAT, with the caption, "Following in the footsteps of the best lawyer I know, even if she doesn't realize it yet." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. Marcus didn't know she had stopped considering herself a lawyer a long time ago, that the dreams he had for her had been buried under the need to pay bills and keep a roof over their heads. But looking at those legal documents in the conference room, Grace felt something awaken inside her. A spark of intellectual interest she had tried to smother for years. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a bit of the old Grace Washington, the legal mind, alive inside the Grace Washington who cleaned offices. And maybe, just maybe, that spark could grow into something bigger if she found the courage to keep it alive. The executive floor of Sterling Technologies remained silent as Grace kept working, unaware that in the coming hours, the fate of millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs would be decided in the very halls she walked alone in the dark of night. It was almost midnight when Grace Washington pushed her cleaning cart down the quiet hallway on the 43rd floor, the wheels gliding smoothly over the dark gray carpet. The golden light spilling from beneath the door of the main conference room made her pause for a moment. It was unusual to have activity this late, even for the lawyers working on the Sterling case. She tapped lightly on the door with her knuckles, a courtesy she had learned during her early days on the job, when she still felt startled interrupting important meetings by accident. There was no answer, but raised voices continued behind the frosted glass door. Grace silently turned the doorknob and entered the room, pushing the cart ahead of her. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. Coffee cups scattered across the table like fallen soldiers in battle, crumpled papers that had lost the war against frustration, and 11 of America's most expensive lawyers looking as lost as freshmen facing an impossible problem. No, no, no! Margaret Hoffman slammed her fist on the table, her perfectly styled hair now showing signs of a long, hard night. You're completely misinterpreting this. Exclusive territorial rights cannot mean the same as preferential territorial access. David Chun stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the city lights as if they held the answers he sought. Margaret, with all due respect, your interpretation totally ignores the precedent set in the 2019 Techno Global versus Innovate Now case. Grace began her silent work, emptying trash cans overflowing with discarded drafts and empty coffee cups. Her movements were fluid and efficient, honed over 3 years of practice, allowing her to be practically invisible even in a crowded space. The lawyers continued their discussions as if she weren't there, their voices rising and falling in waves of mounting frustration. The precedent you're citing, James Mitchell interrupted, adjusting his glasses with an annoyed gesture, specifically applies to telecommunications software, not artificial intelligence. That distinction is crucial. Grace cleaned methodically near Patricia Williams, who didn't even register her presence as she frantically flipped through a pile of legal documents. Williams' words were punctuated by sighs of exasperation. There has to be something we're missing, some angle, some interpretation we haven't considered. As Grace bent down to sweep crumbs that had fallen near Sarah Thompson's chair, her trained ears caught every nuance of the conversation unfolding around her. Legal language, once her second language, flowed through her consciousness like a familiar melody rediscovered after years of silence. Let's go back to basics. David Chun turned away from the window, his dark eyes reflecting the forced determination of someone unwilling to accept defeat. Clause 7C specifically states that the party holding development rights will maintain exclusive control over implementation in designated territories. The question is, what exactly are designated territories? Grace rubbed a microfiber cloth across the table, removing watermarks and crumbs, while mentally processing each word. Her experience as a paralegal had taught her that often lawyers got so caught up in the details they lost sight of the bigger picture. The clause they were debating seemed familiar, not exactly the same, but the legal pattern was one she had encountered before. That's precisely the problem. Margaret Hoffman jumped up abruptly, her chair rolling backward and nearly colliding with Grace, who stepped back gracefully without breaking her rhythm. Megacorp is arguing that designated territories only refers to the North American market, while we maintain it applies globally. William Barnes, the intellectual property expert from New York who had stayed quiet for nearly an hour, finally spoke up, his voice hoarse with fatigue. What if both are wrong? What if designated territories doesn't refer to physical geography, but to market segments? Grace paused slightly as she wiped a glass, her eyebrows knitting together. Market segments. The phrase sparked a memory of a case she worked on back in 2006, where the definition of territory was interpreted in a completely unconventional way, resulting in an unexpected victory for the client. Market segments? Patricia Williams repeated, her voice skeptical. William, that's a risky interpretation. No judge would accept. No judge would if we don't have precedent, Mitchell cut in. But what if we do? Grace kept cleaning, but her mind raced. She vaguely remembered a case, something involving a biotech company and territorial definitions interpreted as application sectors rather than geographic regions. The case name danced on the edge of her memory, tantalizingly close but still out of reach. Precedent for territorial interpretation as market segmentation? David Chun returned to the table, fingers drumming nervously on the polished surface. I need to see that to believe it. Hours passed like minutes as Grace worked silently around the increasingly frustrated lawyers. She wiped every surface twice, organized discarded papers, changed trash bags, and through it all, absorbed every word, every argument, every legal theory swirling through the room like a storm of aimless intellect. We're going in circles, Sarah Thompson finally sighed, pushing her chair away from the table. It's 2:15 a.m., and we're no closer to a solution than we were 6 hours ago. Margaret Hoffman removed her glasses and massaged her temples, where a pulsing headache beat like an unrelenting metronome. Maybe we should consider recommending that Sterling accepts the deal. 70% is better than zero if we lose in court. 70% of 50 million is still 35 million for Megacorp, James Mitchell murmured, his voice heavy with defeat. Robert Sterling will sue us for malpractice if we recommend that. Grace finished wiping the last chair and started organizing her cart, preparing to leave the room. But as she put away the cleaning supplies, her mind kept gnawing at the problem like a dog with a bone. There was something there, a missing piece of the puzzle that the lawyers were overlooking, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Let's call it a night. David Chun closed his laptop with a sound that echoed through the room like a judge's gavel. Maybe a few hours of sleep will give us a fresh perspective. One by one, the lawyers gathered their belongings. Laptops, stacks of documents, half-empty water bottles. The remnants of an intellectual battle ending in stalemate. Their conversations became tired murmurs as they headed for the door, shoulders slumped under the weight of impending defeat. Grace stayed in the room for a few minutes after the last lawyer left, checking if she had missed anything during her cleaning. But her eyes kept returning to the documents spread across the table, especially the copy of the troublesome clause Patterson had left open under the desk lamp's glow. She knew she shouldn't, but she couldn't resist reading the text one more time. The words seemed to leap off the page: exclusive territorial rights, preferential access, designated segments. There was a pattern there, a logic she could almost grasp, but it kept slipping through her fingers like water. Grace turned off the lights and pushed her cart out of the room, leaving America's most expensive lawyers to dream of solutions always just one step beyond their reach. But as she walked down the quiet hallway toward the elevator, her mind kept working, processing and reprocessing every word she had heard, every argument she had witnessed. Sometimes, she thought as the elevator doors closed, the answers don't come from where you expect them to. The second night arrived with the same quiet routine as always. Grace Washington parked her Honda in the usual spot, greeted Jose with the same discreet wave, and grabbed her supply cart with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had repeated these motions 1,000 times. But something was different this night. A restless energy pulsing through her veins, a feeling that the universe was about to change in some fundamental way. The elevator took her again to the 43rd floor, where the main conference room lights were already on, indicating that the lawyers had returned for another session of intellectual warfare. Grace could hear the low murmur of voices through the frosted glass door, a sound she had learned to interpret as controlled discussion. Unlike the explosive frustration of the previous night, she waited in the hallway for almost an hour, cleaning smaller offices and organizing her time until silence finally settled over the conference room. Through the glass, she saw that the space was empty, but the evidence of the legal battle still lay scattered across the table like the wreckage of an intellectual shipwreck. When Grace entered the room, the air was still thick with the scent of strong coffee and the residual tension of brilliant minds struggling with a seemingly impossible problem. Documents were spread across the mahogany table surface, some in neat piles, others carelessly tossed, all marked with colorful pens and yellow sticky notes that looked like flags of surrender. Grace began her usual routine. Emptying trash, cleaning abandoned cups, straightening chairs that had been pushed at odd angles during moments of frustration. But her eyes kept returning to the documents, especially a copy of the infamous Clause 7C left open in the center of the table, illuminated by the warm glow of the executive lamp. For 2 days, she had heard America's top lawyers debate the interpretation of this clause, their voices rising and falling in waves of intellectual passion and professional despair. Exclusive territorial rights versus preferential territorial access. The words echoed in her mind even when she was away from the office, haunting her as she prepared dinner for Marcus, following her through restless dreams. Grace paused in her work, looking around to make sure she was completely alone. The hallway beyond the glass door was silent, lit only by emergency lights casting a ghostly glow on the polished surfaces. Satisfied that no one could see her, she approached the table and allowed herself to read the document once more. Her trained eyes, once paid to detect exactly this kind of detail, scanned the text line by line. The legal language flowed through her consciousness like a familiar river, each sentence triggering memories of similar cases, relevant precedents, and interpretations she had seen over 15 years as a paralegal. The party owning the base algorithms shall maintain exclusive territorial rights as defined in Annex C, Section 2.3, she murmured, following the text with her finger. The sentence continued, while the receiving party shall maintain preferential territorial access as specified in the same Annex C, Section 2.4. Grace frowned. Something about that phrasing bothered her. A familiar feeling that hidden somewhere lay a discrepancy. Over the years, she had developed an instinct to detect inconsistencies in legal documents. Subtle contradictions that busy lawyers sometimes overlooked, but that could mean the difference between winning and losing in court. She flipped through the stack of documents until she found what she was looking for. A complete copy of the original contract between Sterling Technologies and Megacorp. The document was lengthy, nearly 200 pages of dense legal language, packed with subclauses, definitions, and cross-references that required a map to navigate. Grace turned to the end of the document, where the annexes were arranged alphabetically. Annex A, Technical Specifications. Annex B, Implementation Schedule. And then, her heart began to race, Annex C, Territorial and Market Definitions. But when she went back to check the document the lawyers had been using the past 2 nights, a separate printed copy of the isolated clause meant for quick reference, her hands began to tremble slightly. The document the lawyers had been debating referenced as defined in Annex A, Section 2.3 and as specified in Annex A, Section 2.4. Annex A, not Annex C. Grace sank heavily into one of the leather chairs, her cleaning uniform starkly contrasting with the executive furnishings, as the implications of what she had uncovered unfolded in her mind like a slow-motion film. The lawyers had been debating the wrong definitions for days. They had been misled by the text in the isolated clause, a version that apparently contained a typo or a poorly executed correction. While they argued about territorial interpretations based on the technical specifications in Annex A, the true definitions waited untouched and ignored in Annex. With slightly trembling hands, Grace opened Annex C and found the relevant sections. Section 2.3 defined exclusive territorial rights not as geographic regions, but as vertical industry application segments, including but not limited to automated manufacturing, smart logistics, and predictive analytics systems. Section 2.4 defined preferential territorial access as the right of first refusal for licensing in vertical segments not specified in Section 2.3. Grace read and reread the definitions 3 times, each reading confirming what she had discovered. The interpretation William Barnes had suggested the previous night, territories as market segments, was not only correct but literally written into the contract. The lawyers had rejected the correct interpretation because they had been working from the wrong definitions. She stood up and began pacing in small circles around the table, her mind racing as it processed the ramifications. This changed everything. If Sterling Technologies was operating under exclusive rights in specific segments, and Megacorp had preferential access only to unspecified segments, then the entire dispute took on a new dimension. More importantly, if she was right, if the lawyers truly had been working from incorrect definitions, then Sterling might have a significant legal advantage they didn't even know they had. Grace stopped pacing and looked at the phone on the conference table. She could call James Mitchell's main office. She could leave a message. She could. But then reality crashed over her like a cold wave. Who was she? Grace Washington, night cleaner. A 45-year-old woman who had been laid off from her paralegal job during the financial crisis and was now earning $12 an hour cleaning offices. Who would believe her? Who would even listen? She pictured the scene. Calling James Mitchell, explaining she had found an error the best lawyers in America had missed. He would think she was crazy or worse, trying to pull some kind of scam. Building security would be called. She would lose her job, and Marcus would lose the only steady income they had known in years. Grace sat down again, holding her head in her hands. The discovery burned inside her like a toxic secret. She knew something that could change the course of a $50 million case. Something that could save hundreds of jobs at Sterling Technologies. Something that could mean the difference between winning and losing for people who didn't even know she existed. But she was invisible. She always had been invisible. People looked right through her like air, her contributions ignored, her intellect discounted because she carried a mop instead of an executive briefcase. Grace looked at the documents scattered on the table, then at her reflection in the dark window. An African-American woman in a cleaning uniform, alone in a room that represented everything she had lost and everything she still dreamed of reclaiming. Then she thought of Marcus, studying for the LSAT in the library late into the night, dreaming of the day he could follow in the footsteps of the mother he admired, unaware that she had stopped admiring herself long ago. She thought of all the Sterling Technologies employees who didn't know their jobs were hanging by a thread. She thought of Dr. Sterling, whom she had seen a few times in the elevators, always polite to employees at every level. Grace made a decision. She was not going to walk away. Not this time. She had spent 3 years being invisible, 3 years letting her intelligence and experience go to waste because it was easier than fighting. But tonight, with the discovery burning in her hands as proof that she still had value, that she still had something to offer, Grace Washington decided she would find a way to be seen. She didn't know how, not yet. She didn't know when. But she knew the right moment would come, and when it did, she would be ready. For Marcus, for herself, and for all the people whose futures depended on the information only she possessed. Grace carefully reorganized the documents exactly as she had found them, finished her cleaning with usual precision, and turned off the lights. But as she pushed her cart down the silent hallway, she was no longer just the invisible cleaner. She was Grace Washington, and she had a secret that could change everything. 3 days later, the air in the conference room was so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Grace pushed her cart down the 43rd floor hallway at 9 o'clock at night. But this time, the voices leaking through the frosted glass door were not the controlled murmurs she was used to hearing. They were shouting. Months? Months. The voice slicing through the walls like a blade was unmistakably Robert Sterling's, and Grace had never heard the usually calm man sound so desperate. Margaret, I don't have months. I barely have weeks. Grace hesitated in the hallway, her heart pounding. For 3 nights, she had carried the weight of her discovery like a stone on her chest. waiting for the right moment, the perfect chance to share what she knew. But how could a cleaning lady interrupt a meeting of top lawyers? How could someone like her find the courage to challenge the best legal minds in America? Robert, I understand your frustration. James Mitchell's voice sounded forced and calm through the door, but rushing won't help us here. This territorial interpretation is more complicated than any of us anticipated. Complicated. Robert Sterling laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. James, while you debate complexities, I'm signing payroll checks I can't cover. 340 employees are going home tonight without knowing if they'll have jobs next week. Grace approached the door and could see through the frosted glass the silhouettes of lawyers gathered around the oval table. Robert Sterling stood at the head, his hands planted firmly on the mahogany surface, his usually impeccable suit showing signs of 3 sleepless nights. His posture radiated the kind of desperation Grace had seen in her own reflection years ago, when the corporate world had collapsed around her. If we don't get a definitive interpretation of this territorial clause, Patricia Williams said, her voice carrying a brutal honesty that cut through the room, our recommendation will have to be to accept the megacorp deal. 70%, Robert muttered, and Grace could hear the sound of a chair creaking as he sat down heavily. 70% of the rights my father built over 40 years. Better than losing it all in court? David Chun said softly, but his words sounded like nails being hammered into a coffin. Grace took a deep breath and knocked on the door 3 times, the sound echoing down the quiet hallway like gunshots. The voices inside stopped abruptly. "Come in," came Mitchell's tired voice. Grace pushed the door and stepped inside, her cleaning cart making a soft noise against the carpet. The tension in the room was palpable. 11 of America's highest-paid lawyers and the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, all looking at her with expressions ranging from mild surprise to open irritation. "Sorry," Grace said, her voice sounding firmer than she expected. "I didn't know you were still in a meeting." "No problem," Robert Sterling said immediately, and Grace noticed that even in his desperation, he was the only one in the room who really looked at her, who saw her as a person instead of an interruption. "We can take a break while you finish." "Actually," Grace said, and her heart started pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "I was wondering if you would let me speak for a moment?" The silence that followed was so complete that Grace could hear the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant tick of a clock on the wall. Margaret Hoffman raised a perfectly arched eyebrow, her expression suggesting Grace had completely lost her mind. "Speak," Patricia Williams repeated, as if the word were foreign. "About what?" Grace felt a flush rise up her neck but forced herself to continue. "About the clause you've been debating. Clause 7C. David Chun turned fully in his chair to face her. His eyes narrowed with barely disguised disbelief. "You've been listening to our discussions?" "I clean around you," Grace said simply. "It's impossible not to hear." "Look," William Barnes interrupted, his voice tinged with impatience. "We appreciate any interest you might have, but we are dealing with extremely complex legal issues here." "I know," Grace said, and something in her tone made Barnes pause. "I know because I used to be a paralegal for 15 years. That captured the room's attention in a way nothing else had." Robert Sterling leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with interest instead of irritation. "Paralegal," James Mitchell repeated. "Hampton, Bryce and Associates," Grace said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Then Morrison and Partners. I specialized in intellectual property and technology contracts until—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The 2008 crisis had destroyed many careers, and anyone in the room could connect the dots. "Okay," Robert Sterling said slowly. "You have our attention." Grace looked around the table, registering with surreal clarity the varied expressions on the faces turned toward her. Skepticism from Margaret Hoffman. Reluctant curiosity from David Chun. Barely contained impatience from Patricia Williams. And from Robert Sterling, a desperate hope he was trying not to show. "You've been debating whether exclusive territorial rights refers to geography or market segments," Grace said, her words flowing in a steady, confident stream. And you've been looking for precedents to support the market segment interpretation. Correct, Mitchell said cautiously. Grace took a deep breath. This was the moment. 15 years of experience, 3 years of invisibility, and all the courage she could gather converging into this single instant. You don't need precedent, she said. The answer is in the contract itself. You've just been looking in the wrong place. The silence that followed was different this time. It was no longer disbelief but focused, intense attention. Explain, Robert Sterling said, and there was a note of command in his voice that reminded Grace why this man had built a successful tech company. Grace stepped closer to the table, her movements deliberate and careful. The copy of the clause you've been using references Exhibit A for definitions. But in the original contract, Clause 7C references Exhibit C. Patricia Williams frowned. That's impossible. We checked. You checked the isolated copy of the clause, Grace interrupted gently. Not the full contract. Grace could see the exact moment understanding began to dawn on the faces around the table. David Chun reached for his binder and began rifling through documents. Margaret Hoffman stood so quickly her chair rolled back. If that's true, James Mitchell began, then stopped, the implications too huge to voice. Exhibit C, Grace continued, her voice now steady and professional, naturally falling into the speech patterns she'd used when she was still wearing suits instead of cleaning uniforms. Section 2.3 defines exclusive territorial rights as vertical industry application segments. Section 2.4 defines preferred territorial access as right of first refusal to license in segments not specified in 2.3. The sound of pages turning frantically filled the room as multiple lawyers searched through their copies of the full contract. Grace stood near the table, watching as some of America's brightest legal minds realized a janitor had found the key they'd been searching for days. My God, David Chun murmured, his finger tracing the text of Exhibit C. She's right. The segments are clearly defined. Manufacturing automation, intelligent logistics, predictive analysis systems. That changes everything, Patricia Williams said, her voice barely above a whisper. If Sterling has exclusive rights in specified segments, then Megacorp's claim is groundless, Robert Sterling finished, and for the first time in days, there was something other than despair in his voice. They're challenging our right to operate in segments where we have contractually guaranteed exclusivity. The silence that settled over the room was profound and complete. 11 of America's most expensive lawyers sat in stunned recognition that a janitor had found the solution that had eluded them for days. And Grace Washington, standing near the table in her cleaning uniform, realized that for the first time in 3 years, she was truly visible. The energy in the room changed instantly, as if someone had switched on an electric current through the air conditioning. David Chun was the first to move, his hands flying through his leather briefcase until he found the complete original contract. Margaret Hoffman followed a second later, her meticulously manicured fingers flipping through pages with the urgency of someone searching for a life jacket on a sinking ship. Annex C, page 168, Grace said calmly, watching the frenzy she had unleashed. Her voice cut through the sound of rustling papers and heavy breaths like a knife through butter. Robert Sterling was the first to find it. His hands trembled slightly as he opened to the correct page, his eyes scanning the text with an intensity that reminded Grace of Marcus studying for important exams. That total, desperate concentration that comes when everything is on the line. Here it is, he murmured, voice barely audible. Section 2.3. Exclusive territorial rights means sole and non-transferable authority over specific vertical segments of industrial application, including but not limited to automated manufacturing, smart logistics, predictive analytics systems, and enterprise automation interfaces. Patricia Williams leaned in over Sterling's shoulder so far she nearly fell out of her chair. Keep reading, she said, voice tense with anticipation. Section 2.4, Robert continued, his words gaining speed as hope began to replace despair. Preferred territorial access means the right of first refusal for licensing in vertical markets not specifically listed in Section 2.3, subject to approval by the party holding the exclusive rights. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but to Grace it felt like an eternity. She watched the faces around the table transform in real time. Skepticism melting into understanding, understanding exploding into astonishment, astonishment turning into something very close to shame. James Mitchell was the first to speak, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't used it in hours. That means, Grace said, taking over the explanation with the natural confidence of someone who had spent 15 years untangling complex legal language, that Sterling doesn't just have exclusive rights in the specified segments. You have veto power over any megacorp access to the remaining segments. William Barnes exhaled. The breath he'd been holding finally released. Megacorp can't sue us for monopolizing segments where we have exclusive contractual rights. And they can't access the other segments without our permission, David Chin added, his voice rising as the implications became clear. Grace nodded. Preferred access is not a guaranteed right. It's a privilege subject to approval. You're not breaching the contract by denying access. You're exercising your legitimate contractual rights. Margaret Hoffman dropped the document she had been holding, the sound of pages hitting the table echoing through the room like a gunshot. Her face had undergone a complete transformation, from the cold professional arrogance Grace had observed for days to something dangerously close to total disbelief. In 53 years of practice, she said slowly, I have never had a case resolved by, she paused, clearly struggling with how to finish the sentence without sounding utterly condescending. By a janitor, Grace finished for her, without a trace of bitterness in her voice. It's understandable. You didn't expect someone like me to be paying attention. Robert Sterling stood slowly, like a man waking from a dream. His eyes never left Grace's face as he processed not just the solution she had provided, but the full magnitude of what had happened. This woman, whom he had seen pushing cleaning carts down the halls for months without really seeing her, had just saved his company. Grace, he said, and his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room stop whispering amongst themselves. She saved your company? Patricia Williams finished, looking at Grace like she had just performed magic. In 2 minutes, she solved what 11 of us couldn't fix in months. David Chun was shaking his head slowly, his face a mixture of admiration and professional shame. Every time we argued territorial interpretation, every time we debated precedent, every time we argued over case law, the answer was right there in the contract. An answer you would have seen, Grace said kindly, if you'd been working with the correct copy of the clause. James Mitchell got up and started pacing the room, his hands running through his graying hair. We wasted days. Robert almost accepted a deal that would have destroyed his company, and the answer was staring us in the face. Not in your face, William Barnes said, his voice carrying brutal honesty. In hers. Grace saw something we missed because you didn't expect a janitor to understand complex corporate contracts. Grace finished for him. There was kindness in her voice, but also a firmness that made it clear she knew her worth, even if others didn't. Robert Sterling was looking at her with an expression Grace had never seen before. A mix of disbelief, gratitude, and something very much like deep respect. It was how Marcus looked at her when she helped him with particularly tough math problems, but multiplied by 1,000. Grace, he said again, and this time there was a difference in his voice, a quality she recognized. It was how people spoke to her when she was G. Washington paralegal instead of Grace the janitor. How long did you say you worked as a paralegal? 15 years, she answered. And you specialized in intellectual property? Tech contracts, patent disputes, licensing agreements. Grace listed. I worked on some of the biggest tech deals on the West Coast before. She didn't finish but didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew the story. Careers destroyed, lives altered, talented people forced into jobs that didn't reflect their abilities because the world had collapsed around them. Margaret Hoffman cleared her throat, and when she spoke, her tone had completely changed. The condescension was gone, replaced by something Grace hadn't heard directed at her in years. Genuine professional respect. Grace, she said, your analysis was impeccable, absolutely impeccable. More than impeccable, added David Chun. It was the kind of insight we'd expect from a senior partner. Grace felt something stir inside her, something that had been dormant for 3 years. It was the feeling of being seen, valued, having her contributions recognized for what they really were. It was like waking from a long, foggy dream to discover she was still the person she had always been. Patricia Williams had been flipping through documents while the others talked, and now she looked up with an expression that mixed astonishment with something very much like horror. "Folks," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "do you realize that if Grace hadn't spoken up tonight, Robert would have signed that deal tomorrow morning?" The silence that followed was deep and complete. Every person in the room understood the implications. A woman they had treated as invisible for years had prevented one of the greatest financial disasters in Sterling Technology's history. She had saved hundreds of jobs, preserved decades of work, and stopped the destruction of a company on the verge of becoming an industry leader. And she had done it all in 2 minutes, standing next to a cleaning cart, using knowledge she had quietly carried for 3 years while people considered among the brightest in America wrestled with a problem whose solution she had known from day one. That Robert Sterling was still looking at Grace, and now there was something new in his expression. Growing realization that what had just happened was more than solving a legal puzzle. It was a moment that would fundamentally change how he saw competence, value, and contributions coming from the most unexpected places. Grace Washington stood beside her cleaning cart, her posture straight and dignified, watching as some of America's most powerful minds struggled to process the fact that she had accomplished in minutes what they hadn't been able to achieve in months of expensive, intensive work. The 2-minute miracle was complete. But Grace knew the consequences of what had just happened were only just beginning. Robert Sterling stood still for a long moment, his eyes slowly moving around the oval table, taking in the faces of the men and women he had paid fortunes to solve a problem that a cleaning woman had uncovered in minutes. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed amplified in the silence, marking seconds that stretched like hours as the full magnitude of the situation settled over everyone in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone lean forward, as if drawn by a magnetic field of authority and purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words measured and deliberate, "I want to make sure I understand correctly what just happened here." James Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, but Robert raised a hand, silencing him without even looking his way. "For 3 months," Robert continued, his voice gaining intensity, 11 of the most expensive and educated lawyers in America have been sitting in this room. Harvard Law School, he pointed to Mitchell, Yale, his finger moved to Margaret Hoffman, Stanford, to David Chun, Columbia, to Patricia Williams. Each name fell like a stone in still water, creating waves of discomfort Grace could see rippling across the faces around the table. 140 combined years of legal education in this room, Robert said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Millions of dollars in legal fees, hundreds of hours of research, analysis, debate. And throughout all that time, not a single person noticed we were working with the wrong attachment reference. Grace saw Margaret Hoffman shrink back in her chair, her usually impeccable posture bending under the weight of Robert's words. David Chun kept his eyes fixed on the table, unable to meet his client's gaze. Patricia Williams turned pale, her hands trembling slightly as she shuffled papers that didn't need organizing. "But Grace," Robert said, turning fully to face her now. "Grace, who's been cleaning our offices for months, invisible to all of us, unheard while pushing her cart down the halls." She saw it immediately. Tears began to form in Grace's eyes, but she blinked hard, refusing to let them fall. Not yet. Not when every word coming from Robert's mouth was validating 15 years of work she had thought lost forever. She didn't just see it. Robert continued, his voice now filled with an admiration impossible to fake. She understood the implications. She analyzed the complex legal language. She connected the dots that all of us missed because why? Because she was pushing a cleaning cart. The silence in the room was so complete that Grace could hear her own breathing, could feel her heart pounding against her ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. William Barnes cleared his throat nervously. "Robert, I think we can all agree this was an unfortunate oversight." "Unfortunate?" Robert repeated, his voice cutting through Barnes's words like an axe through wood. "Bill, this wasn't unfortunate. This was arrogance. Pure and simple arrogance. He turned to face the entire table, his hands firmly planted on the mahogany surface. We assumed competence only comes with expensive degrees and skyscraper offices. We assumed someone pushing a cleaning cart couldn't possibly understand corporate contracts. We assumed social invisibility meant intellectual invisibility. Grace felt something break inside her. Not in a painful way, but like a dam breaking when it can no longer hold back the pressure of water behind it. 3 years of feeling lost, 3 years of questioning her worth, 3 years of carrying knowledge no one thought she had. All of it started to crumble under the weight of recognition in his voice. "Grace," Robert said, his voice softening as he stepped closer. "How many other insights have you had over these months? How many other times did you hear discussions where you knew the answer but didn't feel authorized to speak?" Grace hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the truth was so vast she didn't know where to begin. "Many," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had suspected. "Grace Washington," he said, and the formality in his voice made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "I would like to offer you a position in our legal department." The words dropped into the room like a bomb. Margaret Hoffman let out a sound that was almost a choke. David Chun looked up so fast Grace heard his neck crack. Patricia Williams opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. "I will pay for any additional training you need," Robert continued, his voice gaining momentum as the plan formed in his mind. "Legal certifications, continuing education, whatever it takes to get you where you belong. Your starting salary will match what you earned as a senior paralegal, with adjustments for inflation and experience." Grace felt her legs weaken. She reached out and grabbed the corner of the table to steady herself, because suddenly the floor beneath her felt like it was shifting. After 3 years of being invisible, having her contributions ignored, questioning whether she still had any value in the professional world, the man was offering her a chance to return to who she used to be. She began, but her voice failed. The tears she had been holding back finally started to fall, wetting her cheeks in quiet streams of pure, unexplainable gratitude. "You don't need to answer now," Robert said gently. "Take all the time you need to." "Yes," Grace interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I accept." Robert smiled, not the polished, professional smile she'd seen him use with clients and colleagues, but something genuine and warm that completely transformed his face. "May I ask what changed your mind so quickly?" he asked. Grace looked around the room, taking in the faces of the lawyers she had seen minutes before as untouchable and intimidating. Now they seemed human, fallible, and somehow less scary. She wiped the tears from her cheeks and straightened her shoulders. "For 3 years," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I carried knowledge no one wanted to hear. I saw solutions to problems no one thought I could understand. I wanted to contribute, to help, to make a difference. But I was invisible." She paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't want a job tonight, Mr. Sterling. I just wanted to be heard. I just wanted someone to acknowledge that I still have value, that my 15 years of experience didn't disappear just because circumstances changed." Robert nodded slowly. "And now," Grace said, a small laugh escaping through her tears. "Now I feel like myself again for the first time in 3 years, like G. Washington, paralegal, not Grace, the cleaning lady." "Grace Washington, associate attorney," Robert corrected. "If you're willing to work for it." "I studied for the bar exam twice," Grace admitted. "I never had the chance to take it." "You will now," Robert promised. "All the support you need." Grace looked at her cleaning cart, then back at the faces around the table. In one night, in 2 minutes of courage, everything had changed. Not just her career, not just her financial outlook, but her very sense of self-worth. "Thank you," she said to Robert, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for listening to me." "Thank you," Robert replied, "for reminding all of us that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the people we most need to hear from are the ones we assume have nothing to say." The clock on the wall kept ticking, but now the sound didn't seem to mark lost time. It sounded like the start of something entirely new. 3 months later, the golden light of an April morning sun filtered through the windows of the 23rd floor, casting geometric patterns on the gray carpet of the law firm office. Grace Washington adjusted the navy blazer she had bought the previous week, her first professional clothing purchase in 3 years, and checked her reflection on the polished surface of the conference table. Her outward transformation was striking, but the real change, she knew, had happened that January night when she finally found her voice again. "Grace, can you review the licensing terms in the Phoenix Tech contract?" David Chun asked, handing her a thick folder. There was no trace of the condescension that once tinted his voice when he spoke to her. Now it was the tone professionals used with one another: respectful, collaborative, confident in each other's skills. "Of course," Grace replied, taking the documents. "Do you want me to focus on the territorial clauses, considering what happened with the Megacorp contract?" David smiled. "Exactly. Nobody better to catch those details." Grace settled at her new desk. Not just any desk, but a full ergonomic workstation with 2 monitors, a personal laser printer, and a nameplate that read Grace Washington, Senior Contract Analyst. Every time she looked at that nameplate, a warm feeling spread through her chest, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long, dark storm. Her phone rang, and Marcus's familiar voice filled the speaker. "Mom, you won't believe what happened." Grace laughed, a rich sound that now came easily after months of feeling valued and heard. "Tell me, baby." "Professor Martinez said my constitutional law analysis was the best in the class. And there's more. He wants me to apply for the honors research program next semester." Tears welled up instantly in Grace's eyes, but this time they were tears of pure joy. Marcus had blossomed in recent months, inspired not just by the full scholarship he had received for his pre-law studies, but by the transformation he had witnessed in his mother. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You're achieving dreams I didn't even know I had at your age. You showed me it's never too late to fight for what you deserve," Marcus said. "You taught me intelligence and worth don't depend on others recognizing them." After hanging up, Grace sat for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of how their lives had changed. Not just financially, though the senior contract analyst salary was more than she had earned as a paralegal years ago. The real change was in how she saw herself, how Marcus saw her, how the world treated her when she walked into a room. "Grace!" Patricia Williams's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Robert wants to see you in his office." Grace found Robert Sterling standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that dominated his office, looking out over the city stretching below. When he turned, his smile was genuine and warm. "How are you adapting?" he asked. "Better than I dared to hope," Grace admitted. "It's like coming home after a very long trip." Robert nodded. "I wanted to talk to you about something. We're expanding our training program for new paralegals, and I'd like you to lead part of the curriculum." Grace felt her heart race. "You want me to teach? Specifically, I want you to teach contract analysis and critical thinking. But more than that, I want you to teach something that can't be learned from books: how to see patterns others miss, how to question assumptions, how to have confidence in your own insights even when they go against conventional wisdom." A week later, Grace stood in front of a class of 8 new paralegals, ranging from recent college graduates to career changers in their 40s. The nervous energy she had felt the first morning had given way to something she recognized from the first time she had helped a client understand a complex contract years ago: the pure joy of sharing knowledge that could make a real difference in people's lives. "How many of you think you need a law degree to understand complex legal contracts?" she asked. Several hands rose hesitantly. Grace smiled. 3 months ago, I was a cleaning lady. I had been out of the legal field for 3 years, working nights and weekends, invisible to the very people who are now asking me to review their most important contracts. She could see the faces before her changing, curiosity replacing uncertainty. The difference between then and now isn't education or training or even experience. The difference is someone finally listened when I spoke. And that's the most important lesson I can teach you. Your voice matters. Your insights matter. Not because a professor or a boss tells you they matter, but because clear thinking and careful analysis always have value, no matter where they come from. Sarah Chun, a recent UC Berkeley graduate, raised her hand. But how do we develop confidence to speak up when we're surrounded by people with more experience? Grace thought for a moment. 3 months ago, I was in a conference room with 11 of America's top attorneys. They had been working on a problem for months. I saw the solution in minutes, but it took courage to speak up. Not because I wasn't sure of the answer, but because I wasn't sure anyone would listen. What if you hadn't spoken up? Asked Michael Rodriguez, a 42-year-old career changer who had left teaching to pursue law. The company would have lost $50 million and hundreds of people would have lost their jobs, Grace said simply. Sometimes what you have to say is more important than who you think you are to say it. As the students worked through exercises, Grace walked around the room, offering guidance and encouragement. She found herself remembering her grandmother, who always said wisdom is passed down from generation to generation not through books, but through stories, through example, through people who had learned through trial and hardship and were willing to share what they had discovered. At the end of the day, Robert appeared in the classroom doorway. How did it go? Grace gathered her materials, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. Good, really good. These are bright people, Robert. They just need confidence to trust their own instincts. Like you did, he observed. Like I did, she agreed. They walked together down the corridor, past the offices where Grace had once pushed cleaning carts, past conference rooms where she had once arranged chairs and emptied trash cans while major decisions were made around her. Now, she was part of those decisions. Her voice was heard. Her insights were valued. Grace, Robert said as they reached the elevator. May I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret not speaking up sooner? During all those months when you were cleaning our offices, listening to our debates, knowing answers we couldn't find. Grace considered the question carefully. The elevator arrived, but neither moved to enter it. For a long time I thought about that, she said. I wondered if I should have tried harder to make myself heard, if I should have forced people to listen. But now I think, maybe everything happened when it needed to happen. Maybe I needed those 3 years to understand what it feels like to be invisible, so I could help others who feel the same way. Robert nodded slowly. Before that night in January, I thought I understood recognizing talent. I thought I was good at seeing potential. But I was only looking where I expected to find it. The elevator arrived again, and this time they stepped inside. Now I understand, Robert continued, that some of the most valuable insights come from people society overlooks. People who see clearly because they have to, because nobody else is going to see for them. As the elevator descended, Grace reflected on how radically her life had changed. Marcus was thriving in school, inspired by his mother's courage to reclaim her professional identity. Her financial situation had stabilized, allowing her to think about the future rather than just survive the present. But most importantly, she felt like herself again. Not a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but a professional whose knowledge and insights had real value. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, where the late afternoon sun streamed through large windows. Other employees were leaving for the day, some heading home to families, others off to evening activities or advanced classes. Grace watched them and thought about how many stories were represented in just this one building. Stories of struggle and success. Dreams deferred and dreams realized. Voices silenced and voices finally heard. Grace, Robert said as they reached the building's main entrance. Thank you. For what? For reminding all of us that true intelligence isn't about titles or degrees or where you went to school. It's about seeing clearly when others cannot. It's about having the courage to speak the truth when everyone else is looking the wrong way. Grace smiled, thinking about Marcus, the students she was now teaching, all the people who had valuable insights but lacked the confidence or opportunity to share them. Maybe, she said, the real lesson is that wisdom can come from anywhere. We just have to listen carefully enough to hear it. As they parted ways outside the building, Grace looked back up at the 23rd floor where she now worked every day. 3 months ago, she had been invisible in these same halls. Tonight, She was walking home as a valued member of one of the city's most prestigious legal teams. Not because she had gained new knowledge, but because someone had finally recognized the knowledge she had carried all along. The late spring air was warm against her face as she headed toward the bus stop where Marcus would soon meet her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Not as someone who had settled for less than she deserved, but as someone who had found her way back to her true calling through courage, patience, and the willingness to speak up when it mattered most. And tomorrow, she would return to help others find their voices too, because if there was one thing Grace Washington had learned, it was that everyone has something valuable to contribute. They just need someone willing to listen when they finally find the courage to speak.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.